Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar, Strategies for Improving Enterprise Application Security, sponsored by WhiteSource and broadcast by UBM. I'm Sara Peters, Senior Editor of Dark Reading, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the Resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we will ask you to complete our survey found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we will be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. Now, on to the presentation, Strategies for Improving Enterprise Application Security. Discussing today's topic are Brad Causey and Rami Elron. Brad Causey is CEO of Zero Day Consulting and an active member of the security and forensics community worldwide. Brad tends to focus his time on web application security as it applies to global and enterprise arenas. He is a member of the OWASP Global Projects Committee and the president of the International Information Systems Forensics Association chapter in Alabama. Brad is an avid author and writer with hundreds of publications and several books, and he also holds dozens of industry-recognized certificates such as CISSP, MCSE, CEH, CIFI, and CGSP. Rami Elron is Senior Director of Product Management for WhiteSource. Rami has more than 25 years of experience in companies such as IBM, BMC Software, and more, thereby directing large-scale projects and driving successful customer-facing engagements in data security, data storage, data science, product management, and business strategy. In addition, Rami is an acclaimed presenter and co-author of several books and international security-related standards. So these two gentlemen know what they are talking about, and I will pass it on over to them now. Brad is going to take it away first. Brad, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sara. So we can go ahead and get right into it. We're going to focus a little bit, just kind of at a high level, on how we can improve from a program level. And what I mean by that is having, establishing, and improving our application security program from within our enterprise. And so there's a couple of different avenues we're going to take and travel on, and I think everybody will enjoy what we're going to cover. So the first thing we have to do is get on the same page. So what are we trying to accomplish? What is the mission? What are the business and technology goals that we have as a team to approach? So the first thing we're going to probably all agree on is that we want to decrease the number of security bugs. We want to find fewer. We want to have to work on resolving fewer if we can. So that's pretty straightforward. What about decreasing security costs? So obviously, security is a cost center that is very expensive. The tools are expensive, the employees are expensive, and so as a business, security doesn't really make you a lot of money depending on how you look at it. And so we want to decrease the amount of money that we spend on that, and if we can, maybe even increase some of the efficiency there too. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. We also want to decrease the security impact. How many of us have actually been in meetings as a security analyst and everybody in the meeting room is, yay, we're glad security is here. They're going to make our job easier. Said no one ever. And so we want to change that. We want to maybe change how security is viewed and at the same time maybe realize that security isn't the end goal necessarily of everything that we want to do. And so we've got to find that balance point there. We also want to increase the interaction and the interoperability, and I'm going to use that word a couple of times throughout this presentation because I think it's really important and hits what we want to convey here. We want to increase the interoperability between the developers and the security team because we're all working for the same goal, and at the end of the day, we both have to be happy with the direction that we're going. We also want to obviously increase the security of our applications because that's what we're here to talk about. And at the end of the day, that is the mission of the security folks, and usually the developers get a big smile on their face too when they get the thumbs up from a security perspective. So definitely a mission we can all agree on. And finally, increase the overall enterprise security posture, because what we're doing from an application perspective impacts a lot more than just the application security itself. There is a lot of moving parts involved in that. In many enterprises, the application is the business. It is how we make our money, or it is a significant portion of what supports our business. And so its importance can't be understated. And we need to recognize the role that we're playing. At the end of the day, it is a business after all. So we're going to talk about the roadblocks first. Why are we not already hailing our fantastic security program that we have and how successful we are? Well, there's some common themes that we see between companies as they run into trying to establish these enterprise application security programs. So the first one is our security teams versus our dev teams. And so that's really issue number one. We shouldn't be fighting against each other, although we generally do. And the reason that we do is because the developers write the code comes to the security team, they say this is bad, you got to go fix it. And so now we're telling developers they're doing a bad job, right? And they're really not. This is the way things work. But it can often come into a situation where there's a conflict there. And we want to avoid that if we can. So let's get down to some specific challenges as it relates to this. So challenge number one, development security. And I'm not just talking about developers and the applications that they're writing, because there's a lot more to it than that. We have IDEs, we have supporting infrastructure, we have a number of different components that go into having a development shop, and each one of those brings its own security risk to the table. And so we want to stop making new risk first. And we can do that by really scrutinizing the tools that we use from a development perspective. So we're not out there downloading 7 different file transfer tools, from SourceForge, for example. And so we're going through the proper vetting process. We're buying enterprise level software that is patched and maintained. And so these are kind of some things to keep in mind, if you will, when talking about how we can immediately get some return for really little investment, right? So all we're really talking about is just taking the extra time to establish a process for incorporating security into the development group itself. So we talked about development tools, reintroducing bugs. I can't count the number of times where we'll go through a release, we'll talk to the dev team about maybe resolving some security issues, they get resolved, and then maybe that bug creeps back into the code later on down the road because somebody went and maybe copy and pasted a library or copy and pasted some code from an old version, and it works its way back in. Again, that's something we can fix for free. It costs us nothing from a development perspective. All we do is just reuse code that we know is vetted and good. And so if we have a good relationship between the development folks and the security folks, we can certify libraries, we can certify code bases and reusable components that will streamline things so that when we come back around for a security review, maybe we don't hold up the dev team as much. Coding to findings. This is a problem that originated with the security folks. And so the way traditional security review has been handled for applications especially is you deliver an application to me, I do the audit, I review everything, and I send you a report. And my job is to make sure that you put a checkbox by every one of those findings and we close them out. Now, have we really accomplished what we wanted? Yes, in the short term. We're coding to that report. So the developers have a very narrow view of what we want them to do, but we're not looking at this from a global perspective. And so what happens? That same vulnerability shows up on the next report, maybe in a different place in the application because we didn't fix the cause. We just addressed the symptom. And the cause is we're writing insecure code, right? But then we go back and we just code to those reports. So all of that to say, these are free, folks. We literally don't have to spend a dime other than maybe a little bit of time, which I know is not free, but we don't have to invest a great deal of capital in tools and FTEs and hiring folks to solve some of these challenges. They can simply be solved by some good cooperation and process implementation. So continuing down that road, talk about some other challenges that we've had. And this challenge is really hit home in the last 5-7 years since Agile and rapid development has kind of come into play. Rapid development has been around for a really long time, but it really took off when we started moving to Agile development. And so I'm a big fan. I think it's a great way to do business. However, security, we're slow. We don't particularly move fast, and we're not agile as we adapt to new things, right? So the old style, the waterfall method, we would get this massive release, this 2.0 version of the application or whatever it might be. And we would go off and we'd spend 30 days doing static code audits and manual testing and, business logic review and all of this stuff. And then we'd come back to the developers with this massive report of findings. And so it was already kind of an inefficient process, right? But we can't take how we do that today or did that recently and apply that to Agile, right? So our developers are out there and they're putting releases out weekly, every other week. Once a month. And if my code review process is 30 days, and then we still require the development team to resolve those issues prior to going live, well, we just basically broke Agile, and we can't do business that way. And so what you'll find is if security breaks business, then business will ignore security. So we have to make sure that we're playing ball with the business. So how long does it take? It takes us a long time, right? So we got to fix that, and we're actually going to specifically address that in a few slides. Critical showstoppers. So why do we get to the end of the project or the end of the release? Again, kind of talking about the waterfall old school delivery method of major release versions. Why do we wait till the very end to have that security conversation? So if we think about what that process looks like, the functional requirements or user requirements or however those are defined are delivered to the dev team, and they go off in a bubble and they write all this really great code in this awesome looking application, and then once it's done, we deliver it to the security team and they say boo. We just wasted a lot of time. So maybe we can move things around a little bit instead of dropping these critical showstoppers on top of our project teams and saying, whoa, stop everything you're doing and go fix this problem that we maybe could have avoided 2 months ago by getting on the front end of it. So that's something we're going to also talk about. Another challenge that we face is the blame game. I already kind of touched on that a little bit with the developers versus the security folks. And a lot of times you'll get that kind of branch out too, right? And that goes into the communication piece we're going to talk about next. And that is, it's department XYZ's fault. They're telling the marketing department, for example, is telling the developers, we have to get this done, and here's our time frame. And so the devs, who do you really work for at the end of the day? Do you work for the marketing department? You definitely don't work for the security department. And so who is it that you have to lean to? And we're going to talk about how to address that as well. But the point being, it's really easy to get into that blame game of, hey, security guys, I'm busy coding this for the marketing department, and they're the ones who are paying for the project. I don't report to you, et cetera. So something to watch out for. And again, that comes down to just communication and then resolving. In this example that I have here is I have findings and I also have user requirements. What happens when those don't mesh? What happens when the security team tells me I got to have an MFA on this mobile app and the line of business says we don't want that. We specifically did not ask for that or do not want that in our application. Well, now we got a big time conflict, and the developers are stuck in the middle, unfortunately. So how can we fix it? So let's talk about a couple of things. The number one thing, and any time we start having a conversation about security and in any context, not just application security, you have to have top-down buy-in. if the executive level folks who are making the big decisions are not on board with security, you're going to fail. Because inevitably, the business unit's going to go to this executive and say, hey, your security team's stopping progress. We're trying to make $1 million, and your security team tells us we can't do that. So if you don't have support and buy-in from the top down, you're going to have a really hard time being successful in implementing security in any capacity. So I would argue if you're an executive, then you should own that, and you should maybe go be an ambassador. And I have that listed. Who is our advocate? Who on the board of directors? Who on the executive change committee can be our advocate, but can stick up for security and what's in the best interest of the organization from a risk perspective? Who should be involved from a security perspective? So let me dig down into that just a little bit. We can't go off into a bubble from a security perspective and make decisions about what we will or won't do or allow for the business. If we do that and the business is out trying to make money and we start throwing up roadblocks, well, they're going to find ways around them, and it's going to cause a lot of problems. We don't want to do that if we can help it. We want to avoid causing problems. So with that said, if we involve them in the original policy discussions, we go to the marketing department or the sales department and we say, hey, this is what we're planning on doing. We want to improve the security of our organization, and we want you to be involved. So immediately we're winning the hearts and minds, right? We're out there, we're pulling them into the process. We can get feedback from them on what's critical from a profitability or functional perspective. And so long story short on that, we need to involve the key players that are going to be impacted by the implementation of an enterprise application security program. So keep that in mind. How can we present this? The approach that you take shouldn't be one of, hey, we're going to do some AppSec stuff and you guys are going to take it and there's nothing you can do about it. Obviously, that's not going to win you much. So what we can do is approach this from the perspective of, hey, security is a value add for us, okay? With the number of breaches out there and the amount of news headlines, everybody sees this stuff, right? So if you're in one of those market spaces, or even if you're not, you don't want to be the first one, there's value to the users in you providing a secure platform, at the very least, and just staying out of the news, because every one of those organizations are taking huge stock hits every time this comes out. So there is value in integrating security into an organization as a whole. And then talk about actual savings. I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but we have enough breach data now that we can actually calculate down to the record how much it costs when you get hacked, when you lose records, when you lose customer data, whatever that is. We've got some pretty reliable data on the expense of that. And so you take that information and you bump that up against how much it's going to cost you to implement an enterprise security program for applications, and things start to look not so expensive anymore, right? So team integration, huge one, and I'm sure everyone saw this conversation coming, with the last two slides of developers versus security folks, but we got to work together. We have to. The rate at which we are writing code and applications and making releases is so frequent that we would have to staff a security team as big as the development team to make this thing work if we don't work together and work smarter. So we need to bring the development into the security team. We need to push the security team into the development team, or however that looks. But we need to, just like we talked about with the hearts and minds of the business unit folks, we need to bring the development folks into the security conversation. Because guess what? Most security folks aren't professional developers. There might be some, most aren't. But the important thing is we need some input from the development team on how you're doing business so that we can maybe tailor our processes to have a lower impact on what you're trying to do. So let's integrate these folks together. So if we go to the development team and say, hey, we're thinking about having a review every other release, what do you think about that? What kind of effort on average are you seeing to resolve bugs that we're sending you from the security department? And take that and say, how often does it make sense for us to do this so that it doesn't have a huge impact on your ability to perform. Include the security team in scrums, and obviously this is specific to agile development, but there should be an ambassador from the security team in all the development team meetings. Why is that important? Because when you get to the end of a major point release and you've integrated something into your application that is fundamentally flawed from a security perspective, you're going to have to go rewrite that. You just wasted a ton of time and money. If the security folks are involved on the front end, maybe we can look at that whiteboard that everybody's gathered around and say, hey guys, maybe that doesn't look real good from a security perspective. What if we did it this way? So now we literally just saved the company, I don't know how much money from having to recode this thing by just making, a presence in the Scrum meetings and maybe giving some guidance. So I already touched on the ambassadors. The design should be a joint effort, touched on that. So that pretty much covers that. Let's talk a little bit more about the security teams working together with the development teams. Design considerations, I briefly touched on that. However, what I want to make some really important points on is the key application areas. So those are going to be things like authentication, authorization. They're going to be things like data protection, maybe encryption at rest, and then we start branching out into some infrastructure stuff. But it should be relatively obvious where the important security areas of the application are, if you will. And so we can reduce the amount of effort involved in the integration of these teams by focusing really heavily on those first. Let's design them together. And that way, if you get to the end of it and the security folks say, hey, that's no go, well, that's on them at that point. So additionally, there are some really good well-vetted solutions out there. You don't have to roll your own when it comes to authentication, authorization, encryption. We have a lot of those out there, and they're very successful. So take a close look at what's already out there and has the stamp of approval from a security perspective. Security support for integration, and so basically we want to have the security team operate in a support role for the development. What does that mean? Can I pick up the phone as a developer and call the security team and say, hey guys, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? It certainly would save a lot of trouble down the road if we had that level of communication. Bug cycles. Synchronize your service level agreement between your teams. If my service level agreement from a security perspective is to produce a report every 3 weeks for bugs, but the dev team can only close them every 4, what does that mean a year later? Well, that means I'm going to have a lot of outstanding bugs. So maybe we synchronize those. And again, just goes back to working close together. Another approach to dealing with those life cycles is overlapping and offsetting, and they're kind of self-explanatory. With overlapping, if we're delivered a point release, we can tell you about that release while you continue to develop the next one, and then maybe we fix it 2 releases down the road. And that allows us to, not hold up progress when it comes to the application development. And then, of course, offsetting, that one's pretty straightforward, where we're going to do a security release or a security review of a release, and then maybe have that resolved in the next release. And, of course, that's all going to depend on what you're doing as a team. So here, let's throw a wrench in that. Maybe we don't have developers. Maybe we have an enterprise and we have a lot of applications, because we all do, right? But maybe we don't have developers. Well, what does that mean? So how many apps are we using? Most people don't write their own email applications, right? We don't write Google, Gmail. So we're using an enterprise tool, or we're using a third-party tool, or maybe we have internally hosted applications, all these different things. And we can't pick up the phone and call the developer at Google and say, hey, man, I think I found a bug in Gmail, right? So what do we do? A couple of things that we can do. The number one thing you need to remember here from again, we're talking kind of high-level enterprise here, the contract language is absolutely mission critical. If you don't have contract language in there that specifically states that you have the right to either terminate the contract if major security issues are found, or you have the right to actually ask the question. There's a lot of companies out there that don't want to give you the documentation from that Bug Scout report or from that, that security review that they did. And so then you can't validate it. So you can create your own documentation requirements. There are some really good ones out there, by the way. OWASP is one we'll talk about. And utilize internal resources, just going out, reaching out to those companies and try to resolve the issues as best you can. So integrating security. Talk really briefly about these two terminologies are relatively recent. Infrastructure as code and security as code. And what we're talking about here is the influx of cloud and agile. What we want to be able to do from a security perspective is allow the developer to do as much as they possibly can from a security perspective. So I want to do things like, if I'm going to run Burp Suite, for example, against your application on every release, why am I doing that? Why can't the developer kick off a script that does it when he leaves for the day? It runs overnight. The next morning he gets a report in his inbox or on his shared folder, whatever it is, and now he's looking, okay, well, I need to fix these issues. So security hasn't been involved at all. There's really been no effort or loss, and the developer gets to fix the issues before he sends it over to the security folks. So we can automate a lot of this stuff, and we can basically enable developers to do this without too much impact on their side. So we can do things like code scans, library audits, and any type of automated static testing, anything like that, by pushing that over to them. And IT security can be the support infrastructure for that. Maybe doing the installations, maybe showing them how to use it, and integrate that as much as you can. That's going to get us a huge reduction on both ends because now we're not going back and forth to solve these issues. And I did mention that, we still have to do manual testing, right, from a security perspective, and obviously the security team will continue to do some of that, especially for big releases or at a periodic schedule. It won't be frequently. So let's talk about the OWASP Top 10 real quick. This is the 2017 version. A new version is in progress now. Obviously, I'm a big fan of OWASP. They do a ton for the enterprise application security space. And so the reason that this is here is because we just want to briefly talk about what we're seeing out in the wild. And I'm going to move kind of quickly through these. They're available on the OWASP website. If you have any questions, you can check that out or you can reach out to us directly. So we'll talk about A1, which is injection. This is categorized as operating system injection or OS commanding, SQL injection, NoSQL injection, etc. And this really just comes down to input validation. You're going to see a lot of these do. Broken authentication, we've seen some of these in the news recently. We basically want to protect anything that handles authorization or authentication as much as we can. Okay, and this comes down to doing our security process. Sensitive data exposure, seen a lot of those too, right? So the Amazon buckets that have been exposed just due to, not having locked those down or maybe not knowing how to. XML external entities, this is a relatively new thing, and basically it allows us to operate through an XML API or interface and tell the server what to do. It's a pretty neat vulnerability. If you haven't seen it, you definitely should check it out. Broken access controls. This goes hand in hand with A2 and basically talks about users being able to elevate their own privileges or access portions of the application, maybe that they shouldn't. Security misconfiguration, those Amazon S3 buckets I was talking about, there you go right there. And this goes to things like having directory listing enabled or maybe having Apache configured incorrectly so that it allows different types of verbs that we wouldn't normally allow. So this, again, security reviews, right? Cross-site scripting. So I have the question panda here. Why are we still seeing cross-site scripting? Literally 20 years. That's how long cross-site scripting has been a thing. And we are still coding new apps with cross-site scripting, input validation, and output encoding. We've known about it for 20 years. Why are we still doing it? But we are. And not only are we doing it, but we're allowing it to go to production and we're allowing it to be on the public internet. Insecure deserialization, this is not exclusive to Java, but that's really kind of where it stems from. And it's basically not sanitizing after the deserialization on the server side. And then, of course, using components with known vulnerabilities. I'm going to touch on that more, which is why it's kind of highlighted there. And then finally, insufficient logging and monitoring. So, that one's pretty straightforward. We have to know what's going on in our system. We can't investigate anything if we don't. So, going back to A9, components with known vulnerabilities. Now we talk about application component selection. When we are selecting these components, and that's where the yield sign's for, is we need to be cautious. We need to slow down, and we need to think about a couple of different things. Is the library supported? Is it open source? Do you care? Because you probably do and don't know it. And I say that because who are you going to pay to help you fix that if something goes wrong? Well, it's super hard to pay somebody that only has an email address to an anonymous account in the Netherlands, for example, that you can't reach. It's a lot easier to get support from a commercial company that you're buying libraries from. And there are companies out there, by the way, who vet and support libraries that aren't theirs. They vet and support open source stuff. So how long, historically, has that library or component, I'm using library and component interchangeably even though they're not the same thing, time to patch from disclosure of vulnerabilities? Did it take them a week? Did it take them a year? That's important. How stable is it and how actively is it being developed? So we definitely want to look at that, right? Because if it's not being developed and everything else is, then it's going to get outpaced and it's going to be outdated really quickly. How many vulnerabilities has it had historically? If we have one library that's got 17 vulnerabilities last year and we got one that had 3, I might take an extra look at the one that has 3, right? So how frequently do we see vulnerabilities in those components? Secure integration into other components. Obviously, we want to see, our components interact securely with the others, and so that's definitely a consideration. A lot of times, that's available somewhere where you can find it on the internet where it has been used successfully. And of course, in that same tone, interoperability of features and broken dependencies. If the library depends on something that maybe it isn't supported anymore, then that's a consideration. The last thing I want to talk about is container security. This is a really big deal right now. It's caused a lot of problems, and rightfully so. It's new technology. Security, again, like I mentioned, we're this huge behemoth that moves really slow, and then when we get there, we just crush everything. But basically, we haven't caught up to containers yet. We're getting there, right? And there are some things out there that will help you with that. But the idea here is they're fantastic. However, they present some unique challenges for us because they're not really OS. They're really not even infrastructure. It's like a bundle of stuff that's independent of the operator. How do you patch that? How do you scan that for vulnerabilities? And if you do find something that's vulnerable, how do you go fix it when it's in this container and everything depends on it? So it creates some interesting challenges. I have one example here of Alpine Linux. If you go look it up, it only has 2 CVEs listed. However, if you go look at one of the software packages in Alpine Linux, it itself had 11 vulnerabilities. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the vulnerabilities are being applied from a CVE perspective to components inside Alpine Linux and not being bubbled to the surface. So you might go on there and look and say, man, Alpine Linux looks great. So I'm going to go use that. And what you don't realize is there's 75 vulnerabilities spread across 22 different libraries inside that container. So be careful. Reusing images. We find an image that we really like from a development perspective, and we write a whole bunch of stuff with that. And then every time we need to write something new, we pull out that trusty container. Well, once that trusty container's 8 months old, it might have 25 vulnerabilities that haven't been patched. And so now you got to go backwards and forwards because we're going to patch this thing to work forwards as well. So those are all challenges. Those are all really important considerations. Secure image registries. my suggestion is, again, let's talk about an enterprise solution. There are good registries out there, and there are even pay registries that will scan the container and everything in it for security vulnerabilities and give you a report. It doesn't mean you can fix it, but it'll at least let you know. And so that kind of leads me into the secure orchestration process. Orchestrating security versus secure orchestration. If you don't know what orchestration is, it's basically describing the build-out, the automated build-out of the infrastructure for containers and really for an application and everything that supports it. But basically, we can orchestrate security. All of these great things that make development super effective and fantastic for our company, they can all work for security too. So we start helping our dev team build secure containers, and we just roll that into what we already have as an orchestration process. So we can get some wins out of this from a security perspective. And finally, secure orchestration, which is basically, hey, let's do a really jam-up job of introducing security into our orchestration process. So that was a whole lot. I hope you really enjoyed it. I absolutely love talking about it. If you can't tell by my tone, I get really passionate about this stuff because it's super fun. Unfortunately, though, I am going to have to hand you over to Rami. I want to keep talking, Rami, but I know you do too.
Okay. So thank you, Brad, and hello to everyone on the call. The title for my session today highlights top open source security myths that should be debunked. That said, the main gist and theme of this session more precisely revolves around the presentation of opportunities. Not just any opportunities, mind you, but those which can enable open source development to maximize productivity, maximize innovation, and even agility without being held back by security considerations, that is. In the next few minutes, I will explore a few misconceptions that are often attributed to security in an agile product development cycle. As part of this exploration, I would like to highlight a couple of strategies and approaches that are believed to potentially help organizations accommodate salient challenges in the development process. Most importantly, though, they are believed to significantly bolster development productivity. Before we delve into the details, however, let's please move to our very first slide to quickly review some highlights and characteristics concerning the growth of open source software usage. So that should probably come to no surprise. Open source software has essentially transformed the software development industry. It has significantly promoted the developer's ability to quickly and, to relatively cheaply create and a highly compelling application experience for users. As this slide in particular highlights, it has been estimated that open source components account today on average for a substantial percentage of software offerings. 60% to 80% are typical quotes, and some would claim these numbers to even be conservative estimates. This, in any case, represents a dramatic rise in a fairly short period of time, relatively speaking. However, while open source components are proven to be extremely cost-effective when incorporated as part of the development cycle, the incredible boost in open source component usage it serves also to demonstrate another thing, the immense pressure that development teams are increasingly being subject to. Now, this pressure is driven by a highly competitive marketplace, and this calls for developers to accelerate delivery of products that should be valuable, they should be reliable, and unsurprisingly, they should be secure. Critically, the increasing rate of well-known data breaches in the past couple of years, this also made enterprises worldwide more cognizant of the perils associated with a lack of security. And this in particular has led many companies to accept that strong security measures are not merely an ingredient, so to say, of a modern development recipe, but rather, I would say, an imperative pillar of the software development process. So it is only fair to ask at this stage, how well are organizational processes equipped to handle open source vulnerabilities and even remediate them? The question is also highlighted in the next slide, so perhaps we should move to that slide. So you have this question in front of you, but aside from the listed question, it is imperative to acknowledge a rise of novel approaches to accommodate open source security vulnerabilities. Moreover, I think that this rise laid a foundation for innovative thinking that may, among other things, help potentially alleviate a sense of friction. This is an important thing. This is an important concept. Such friction has been noted to transpire between organizational teams, most notably between security and development. The topics that we're about to touch upon in the next few minutes span different areas and approaches, yet complement each other in very interesting ways. So with that said, let's move on to the next slide and start discussing some myths and some opportunities as well. So myth number one is really about security, about agility, and importantly, about the relationship between them. One of the one of the common misconceptions about security and development is that security and agility are mutually exclusive. There are those to say that you can perhaps have an agile process, you can have a security conscious process, but you will not easily be able to have both. While often attributed to large development teams, it may be to a great extent applicable also for many mid-sized and small organizations as well. Now, for the sake of our conversation here, I think that we can hopefully agree that the term agility, loosely at least, reflects a measure of responsiveness, some would say resistance perhaps, to change. What kind of change? Changed conditions, changed requirements, objectives, and importantly, changed prioritizations, which we will touch upon in a moment. To that end, how does a shift-left approach come into play here? In a sentence, a shift-left approach to security would tout early attention to security within the product lifecycle. An example would be that a shift-left approach would help organizations accelerate time to value. It could do so by minimizing the potential cost that is associated, for instance, with a case where a vulnerable component is used within the product. Now, as should come to no surprise, the earlier a security issue is described in the development cycle, the cheaper, the quicker, and typically the easier it will be to fix. Dealing with security does not necessarily have to impede an agile process. This is probably the key takeaway from this slide. In fact, I would say that shifting attention to certain security-related product aspects can realize better process agility. And this is, by the way, not referring to architectural facets alone. Take component selection as an example. This is an emblematic part of the modern DevOps lifecycle. Allowing for secure component selection, definitely at an early stage of the development cycle, can flag components that are identified as being vulnerable. And by doing so, it will minimize the potential hassle that is very likely to be incurred when security-related vulnerabilities are discovered at a later stage. However, the process can also facilitate cooperation among organization teams to leverage their experience. This is really an important aspect, and it could prove critical and incredibly advantageous. With that said, how can delegation of security responsibilities help even further streamline the process? Let's find out by moving to the next slide and our next myth. So, myth 2 is about security responsibilities and about their delegation. Delegation or delegating security responsibilities is not really a too commonly observed practice or an act of confidence for that matter. That might explain some of the challenges that are faced by teams when attempting to streamline security-related procedures that are warranted during the development process. Nonetheless, it is argued that by delegating security responsibilities to engineers, and furthermore by empowering them to focus on security, the risk of adding security vulnerable components to the product can be significantly alleviated. However, it's important to note here and to accentuate that in order for that to be realized in an effective manner, the traditional broad level and high-level security goal setting should transform into more actionable and finer-grained deliverable objectives. It should also transform into a continuous process. While security concerns may perhaps not be always at the top or the very top of developers' mind, a security vulnerability risk should not be assessed only at any single point in time. It should rather be a continuous process. Delegating security responsibilities by the security team means, among other things, that engineering can be empowered with authority, and that authority can help reduce the time to identify root cause for security problems, but there are many other advantages as well. It will likely attain a much higher recovery rate, and when coupled with automation, the delegation of security responsibilities would further extend their value. It would enable frequent security testing, higher accuracy for testing, and a much, much more available time for coding. In order to exhibit a more agile approach to security, it's therefore advantageous to expand the purview of security throughout the full product lifecycle. There's one more thing I would like to add in this context, and it's an observation. The organization must endeavor, in my opinion, to accommodate user preferences for practices that are established in cooperation rather than being dictated. This allows organizations to focus at opportunities that foster innovation and creativity, and not just do what some teams within the organization may say simply as being right. With that being said, it's about time to review how prioritization of vulnerabilities can represent a great opportunity as well. So to discover how, let's move on to the next slide. So this is a special one. The third myth touches upon an interesting concept, namely challenges that potentially surround prioritization of security vulnerabilities. Now, the first two topics that we touch upon gave us a chance to explore potential for process efficiency, and the way it was done is by observing how the product lifecycle timeframe could be better utilized. But what if we could add to the mix better effectiveness and potentially improve focus by trimming non-critical aspects throughout the lifecycle? This would be tremendously important. Attempting to attain a development process agility with a security-conscious mindset can easily become a taxing proposition. That is, of course, unless overhead is minimized through effective task and objective prioritization. What is effective prioritization? Well, I would say that it is strongly dependent on the ability to accurately associate a qualitative, perhaps better yet, a quantitative weighting to the target object of prioritization. But an attractive proposition for such an objective is to prioritize security vulnerability handling. And the key thing here is that this should be based not on reported library vulnerabilities alone, but based on vulnerabilities that are verified to be effectively referenced by user code. It may not be feasible or easy enough to effectively prioritize handling of security vulnerabilities, especially when many are reported with a high severity score. That said, relying on a reported vulnerability score as the sole metric for prioritizing vulnerability handling may prove to be less than optimal, since in practice, and this is the key thing here, in practice, user code may not necessarily include actual references to vulnerable library entities. As is highlighted in this slide, such a hypothesis appears to be substantiated in preliminary research, and it shows that a significant portion of reported security vulnerabilities in open source libraries, more than 2/3 in fact, was found in preliminary studies to not be referenced by developer code. Such findings have significant consequences. The total effort otherwise warranted to address reported open source security vulnerabilities may be, by having such a capability, potentially reduced in a substantial manner. And this would save a sizable portion of development time that may be relegated to much, much more valuable objectives. What's more, the potential value proposition complements very nicely, if I may say, the points that we touched upon in previous slides. So given all that, let's now move to our last slide and attempt to summarize. I think that in the last few moments, we've been able to review a few misconceptions that are attributed to security and development. And importantly, in doing so, we've highlighted challenges that the implementation of security must be able to overcome, especially in order to improve enterprise application security and to go beyond mere automation. Mere automation is not meant to downplay the significance of automation. It is important, but the whole idea behind this session is to highlight how we can do much, much more. And here is a quick summary of our main recommendations and takeaways. So let's start, obviously, with recommendation number 1. Employ a shift-left approach to security in order to facilitate better practices. What this can do is to help organizations accelerate time to value by minimizing vulnerabilities via mitigation. A shift-left approach can also, importantly, facilitate collaborative work of the security and development teams, among others, and it will enable them to establish a process that is better poised to maximize productivity, which was a key word throughout this session. The next recommendation is to streamline processes and to streamline policies in particular that may be drivers for such processes. Delegation of security responsibilities can help engineering increase the focus on security, pure and simple. But they can also help allay the risk incurred by adding vulnerable components to the product mix. Delegation, as it turns out, also enables vulnerability risk to be far more, I would say, easily to be appraised within a continuous integration process. And finally, our last recommendation is to seriously consider deeper analysis to enable prioritization and to catapult open source vulnerability remediation. To this end, a security conscious mindset can truly become a reality within DevOps and the DevOps product lifecycle. And this is if the attention is set to reduce overhead through effective task and objective prioritization. I believe that by enabling effective prioritization of vulnerabilities, companies need not depend any longer on reported severity classification or severity scores alone, and this would potentially extend the overall development bandwidth to support much more valuable objectives. And with that concludes my part. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rami, and thank you, Brad. That was marvelous. I just learned quite a bit. We do have some time for questions from the audience, but before we begin with today's Q&A, I'd like to ask the audience, please direct your attention to our webinar survey available on the right of the presentation window. If you closed the survey, you can reopen the widget by clicking the icon along the bottom of your screen. Thank you in advance for filling that out. Your participation in the survey does allow us to better serve you. Now, on to the Q&A portion of our event. As a reminder, to participate in Q&A, just type your question into the text box located to the right of the presentation window, or click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If we're not able to answer all submitted questions during today's webinar, we'll be sure to share them with our speakers who can reply to you offline. I'd like to start, Rami, first with something that you were saying towards the end of your presentation. I just want to clarify it because it was very fascinating. You were myth-busting, and that last slide said 70% of reported vulnerabilities in open source libraries are not referenced by the developer's code. So are you saying there that that I might have some code that uses an open source library, and if that library has a vulnerability in it, my code might not be vulnerable? Am I understanding that correctly?
So in general, yes, because the vulnerability is a result of a direct or indirect reference made to a vulnerability component. And if it is possible to establish that there are no such references in practice, it would not necessarily mean that one should not consider any updates to such a component. We should always seek to come with the latest and the most recent components. But nonetheless, in terms of prioritization, it would be significantly important for us to make sure that we deal first with those areas that a direct or indirect vulnerability would pop up. And in this particular case, this would be deprioritized.
Hello there. I just seem to lose my connection. Do we have everybody else?
It's Brad. I'm still here.
All right. Sorry about that, everyone. We're having some kind of major storm here in New York. Maybe that was my problem. My question was, originally I was trying to clarify with Rami something about the end of his presentation about these reported vulnerabilities in open source libraries that are not referenced by the developer's code. I was trying to clarify if he was meaning that if there is a vulnerability in a library that my code is using, it's possible that I'm still not vulnerable. I just wanted to clarify if I was understanding that correctly.
So I assume that my response was not heard. I mentioned it briefly earlier. Do you hear me now?
Hey,
I
Rami,
can hear you.
Actually, I think your response went through fine. I think Sara may have disconnected.
Okay, great. So I was the only one who
But it was a great
All right,
explanation.
great.
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. Then we can move on, and I'll go back and listen to the archive and educate myself. Excellent. Okay, so the next question that I had was really for both of you. You both spoke about this kind of, I don't want to say a war, but some conflict between security and agility, and how you can make it work between the two so that there isn't that friction. And you both gave some suggestions on how to make it work better. Brad, I'm going to start with you on this first. Do you think that there is, I guess, kind of a step one in how to kick that off? If I want to kind of show some good faith with my developers on how I can improve their security and not slow them up too much, is there something that we can do kind of right off the bat that helps out without tripping them up?
There absolutely is, yeah. So I would say, and that's a really good question, by the way. I would say the best way to approach that to start is to involve the executive team. And so, there's going to be somebody at the top of the food chain on the developer side, and there's going to be probably a separate person at the top of the security food chain, and those two folks need to be on the same page. The reason that that's so important is the conflict between security and development historically has been a culture thing, because, I'm not able to secure this app because the developers won't do it, or the developers aren't able to write their code because the security guys are being mean. And so we just never had good collaboration there. And I think it has to start from the top, because if the director of both groups are saying, hey, you guys need to cooperate and here's how I want you to do it, it's going to have a lot more teeth than if maybe the developers or even the security analysts were to on their own go out and initiate that. You got to have that upper management backing. So.
And would you include HR departments in that at all? I ask because one of our viewers has asked about including the HR department in our efforts.
I absolutely would, without a doubt. HR has become, really more in the last 5, 6, 7 years, a pretty important component of the business overall. And they drive a lot of that. So I think involving them is going to help, absolutely. and it's going to depend a lot on kind of how your business works, but it should be pretty obvious if that's a good move to involve HR from that perspective, because you're going to be talking about a lot of interaction between departments and individual groups. So I definitely don't see any harm done in that.
Excellent. Well, I'm afraid that we are right at the end of our time, gentlemen, so I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds to give final thoughts to the audience before we wrap up. Rami, you're first. Any last words for the people?
So it's quite challenging to summarize everything in 30 seconds, so let me quickly make a short comment. I think that incorporating security into the life cycle has been, in some ways, notoriously acknowledged as a challenge, and there have been a variety of reasons for that. But I think that in order for security to not become a barrier to agility, there are quite a few things that need to be addressed, and the implementation of security must be able to overcome three major challenges with regard to security ownership, the scope, and the timing. And just as a side comment, I would say that the notion of ownership could potentially plague and slow down processes, but if it's clear who should drive and coordinate security-related objectives, especially early enough in the process, it would be possible for each party to opt for a different approach and still work together to come up with something that is highly valuable and productive to all parties.
Excellent. Brad, any thoughts?
Absolutely. Just one super brief one, and that is, to those of you out there that are on the security side of the fence, just remember, at the end of the day, we're here to do business and we're here to make money for the most part, or whatever your mission is for your organization. And the more that we as a security department support that, the better off we're going to be, the better we're going to be looked upon when we finally do go say, hey, this is really bad, maybe we shouldn't do it.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen. I think that we have more shows at Dark Reading to do on container security and on third-party component security. There's always more to say, both on those subjects specifically and on application security. The number of topics just never is exhausted. That is all the time we have today, everyone. Thank you to Brad and to Rami. Dark Reading appreciates your time and expertise on today's topic. Thank you to our sponsor, WhiteSource, as well as to all of you in the audience. We appreciate your attention and participation. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been able to listen to the event today. This webinar is copyright 2018 by UBM. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and WhiteSource, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guests, Brad Causey and Rami Elron, I'm Sara Peters. Thanks for your time and have a great day.